welcome everyone to our pretty annual Stratton Lecture. I was just talking with Dan earlier, wondering when it started, and we both sort of looked at one another. What I can tell you is that I have been here for 11 years, and it's been going on for 11 years. So it's over. I can honestly say it's a community public lecture that we have been trying to do on an annual basis for over a decade. We are able to do so because of a very, very strong partnership with the Animal Welfare Foundation of Canada. It is a national charity that supports innovative education and research programs that help animals. And what I think is really cool is that they differentiate between the community level, the provincial, and the national level. So they look at all aspects of trying to help doing these innovative programs and help support them in sort of a common vision of, and there's some students from or most of my students, or actually I should say all of my students from 314 should be sitting in the class, a great example of trying to bring resources to that interface of animals and society. The Animal Welfare Program started in 1997. It was started with my two great colleagues, Dan Weary, who's over there, who you'll hear from at the end, and David Fraser, who is on sabbatical this year. And he's, at this point, in the Czech Republic, looking at trying to help the Eastern Europeans in terms with some of their challenges to do with farm animal welfare. But sort of across the Pacific, the Atlantic Ocean, David does send his regards to everybody. So today we've got a fabulous speaker, and I got to spend some time with Chris yesterday, and one of our things that we like to do with this lecture is to showcase some of our own students. And so one of the things I'm going to do before I introduce Liv is ask the graduate students in the Animal Welfare Program, or the postdocs, those of us that sort of have this day-to-day working relationship with Dan and I, to stand up, and so that everybody can see them. And those of you that are visitors, make sure that you ask them a question, because each of them is here because they're super passionate about animals, and they all have a story to tell. So on that note, can I ask Liv to come up? Liv is going to do the formal introduction of our guest speaker. So we'll have the lecture, and then Danny will close the lecture, and I encourage you guys to all ask lots and lots of questions, right?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
Great, welcome. Formal but quick introduction of Chris. I'm grateful that you're all here, and I'm grateful that Chris has come to speak with us. I and a few other of my wildlife colleagues from the Animal Welfare Program have worked with Chris on issues related to the interface of conservation and welfare, a topic I know he's going to speak about today. So Chris has an undergraduate degree in zoology and a master's in primatology from the University of College London. After that, he spent some time working for animal protection organizations. One that also includes a stint as a chimpanzee keeper at a sanctuary in the US. I'm sure he has colorful stories to share with you if you corner him somewhere.
Yeah, not for public consumption.
And so since 2004, he's been with the Born Free Foundation in the UK. So he is their programs manager of captive wild animals in science. So part of that work includes working with animals in zoos, in circuses, and also non-domesticated animals as pets. So in addition to the research, the campaigning, and the lobbying, and the investigation that he has to do with the Born Free Foundation, he is also bravely, some might say, and some might say foolishly, completing a PhD at the University of Bristol in the UK on the welfare of zoo animals in the UK. He's also the European rep for the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries.
Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, yeah.
So he has a lot on his plate and a lot of responsibilities, and so we're really grateful again that he's here. So So welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Liv. Thank you, everybody. And that introduction makes it sound like I know what I'm talking about, and goodness knows. Right. Well, it's a genuine honour to be here. I've known about the animal welfare programme at UBC for a number of years now, and I've always been so impressed with the outputs from it. So, as Liv's already said, I've worked at the Born Free Foundation for the last 10 years, and again, as this may hint at, I work both on animal welfare issues in captive animals, but also at the interface between conservation and animal welfare. And I guess these are the things that I hope you're going to learn a bit more about from my presentation. Firstly, what is the Born Free Foundation? I'm just going to check if I may have issues with this slideshow. Try again. Yeah, right. Quick show of hands. Who has seen the film Born Free? Okay, quite a few of you. Okay, Born Free was about Joy and George Adamson and their work with lions. The actor and actress that starred as Joy and George Adamson were Bill Travers and Virginia McKenna. And one might think that their experiences with the lions is what led to the establishment of the organisation. And in many ways it was. It was certainly, it gave them a huge insight into wild animals, the needs of wild animals. But actually what it really was many years later. It was the result of a later film called An Elephant Called Slowly that had been filmed by Bill. And they had found, well, for the film, they needed a young elephant, and they'd found a young elephant in a trapper's yard in Nairobi. And they worked with that elephant on that film again in the 60s. And at the end of the film, they asked if they could buy that elephant and give it to Daphne Sheldrick, who some of you may be familiar with, so that she could, in effect, reintroduce it to the wild. And the authorities said, yes, sure, you can buy this elephant, but we're going to catch another one. So, as many of you may know, catching baby elephants can sometimes be a fairly brutal and traumatic experience. And so Bill and Virginia were left with no choice, and they had to allow this elephant in London Zoo many years later. And unfortunately, scared myself there. Unfortunately, Polly Polly died not long after that photo was taken. Actually, the anniversary of her 30th anniversary of her death has just passed. She passed away after a successful campaign to get her relocated from London Zoo to London Zoo's country zoo called Whipsnade. And unfortunately, she died during the transit. And it was really that sparked Bill and Virginia to set up the Born Free Foundation and dedicate their life to the welfare of wild animals. And over the time, it's evolved from just looking at animals in zoos to now having very thriving and very, in my opinion, very successful program of conservation programs, projects in the wild. So, what is animal welfare? I want to just give a little overview of animal welfare as I see it relates to wild animals. And I know many of you in this room will work on farmed livestock, on laboratory animals, etc. But there's a lot to learn from that. But I think wild animals in captivity present a specific set of problems in terms of ensuring their welfare. I know, obviously, many of you will know David Fraser, a very famous and a great guy. And I was with him 2 or 3 days ago in Detroit, and he sends his regards. David worked on this definition for the OIE, which is the World Animal Health Organization of Animal Welfare, which I think is a really nice overview, captures the idea of positive welfare in terms of a good state of welfare. And many other people have tried over the years to define welfare in a succinct manner. Marion Dawkins, this is how she views things. Are the animals healthy? Do they have what they want? Those are the questions to ask if you want to think about how an animal's welfare is. John Webster has made it even more succinct, that good welfare is fit and feeling good. And something that's recently gaining ground from the Farm Animal Welfare Council in the UK, which is a government advisory body on farm animal issues that, again, many of you, I'm sure, will know. They've started promoting this idea of a life worth living. And it's interesting that while they've come up with that concept in relation to farmed animals, I think it's a particularly valid one to consider when we're talking about wild animals. And how do we measure animal welfare? Well, it obviously presents challenges, and those of you that are on the program and associated subjects will know how difficult that is. And I'm simplifying a lot, but we can look at the inputs. We can look at what we offer animals. We can look at the inputs are generally considered to be resource-based or management-based. So what are we investing so that the animal can live? So we can obviously, through financial investment, we can offer good, hopefully good conditions. We can design hopefully well-designed infrastructure. We can offer a good diet, these sort of things. And we hope that the outcomes, i.e. how the animal responds, the animal-based measures of welfare will reflect that. And obviously, so our investment and our inputs manifest in the animal as its behavior, as its physiology. So, for example, you offer good vet care, and you hope that health is positive. You offer environmental enrichment, particularly prevalent in animals in zoos, of course, and you hope that the behavior reflects natural behavior. Any size of enclosure, if you keep an animal in a larger enclosure, you hope that it's going to move around more. But consider this hypothetical example. That's not a hypothetical elephant, that's a real elephant, but this is a hypothetical example. Let's say this elephant lives in a big enclosure, in a nice enclosure, in a well-provisioned enclosure, and it has opportunities for social communication and social interaction with other elephants. It has all the plethora of things that are complex things that work together to provide what an elephant needs. Take a look at this picture, and you'll see that in the grass has been worn a circular path, and this elephant has worn that path by walking round and round and round. The point I'm trying to make here is that you can offer the very best of care. I'm not saying in this case that that's actually what's being offered, but if it was, you could offer the very best care. But the animal's reaction, the animal's outcome may not reflect that. The animal's outcome may, of course, in the case of long-lived wild animals such as those that are kept in zoos, may be affected by many other things, particularly its history and its personality, its experiences in the past and its personality. So in the case of this particular animal, the reason it's worn a path in the grass, I suspect, is that it's spent time in 7 zoos, it's been chained in at least 2 of them, it's spent time in a circus, and it's travelled between at least 3 countries across Europe before ending up here. So in my view, I think perhaps more, and this is an arguable point, more than laboratory animals, farmed animals, it's incredibly important to consider both the personality, and I know that there's work showing that there's influence of personality in farm and laboratory animals, but also the experience that the animal has had in the past, because that can really affect the welfare outcomes for that animal. Okay. A general rule of thumb that's widely acknowledged amongst the zoo community and zoo professionals is summed up in this quote. And this is a quote from Michael Hutchins, who used to work for the American Zoo Association, or Association of Zoos and Aquaria, I'm sorry, the acronym's changed. An understanding of a species' basic biology, including its feeding, ecology and diet, social organisation and behaviour, reproductive biology and so forth, are critical for developing successful methods of captive animal husbandry and care. Knowing what the animal is supposed to do is a good place to start when you want to find out about its welfare. And I couldn't agree more. I really couldn't. I think it's absolutely fine. And I'm a firm believer in the precautionary principle when it comes to keeping animals in zoos. And I really feel that unless we're confident that we can guarantee wild animals a reasonable standard of welfare, perhaps we should start asking questions about whether or not we should keep them. So what is the state of our knowledge of animal welfare? So I'd like you to read each of these. I don't know how clear it is, but it's actually not the point. That is the mammals. That is an overview of the families within the mammalian order. And arguably, I think we have some knowledge and some experience of these taxa, these groups of animals. So we've got domesticated cats, domesticated dogs, domesticated equines, horses, donkeys, domesticated pigs, mice and rats, and sheep, goats, and cattle. I think there's probably one or two other things we could add to that list, but that's a good starting point for where we are. And I think if you look at this evolutionary diagram and relationship with all these orders and families and species, you start to see that there are some big gaps between the things we know about and the things we don't. And yeah, fine, these species are the ones that we have our most frequent interaction with. These are, in many cases, species that we've co-evolved with, we've selectively bred, so we certainly do have a starting point to know about what they need. But what about animals that we're keeping in zoos? If anyone's brave enough to shout out, who can tell me what the most common species of mammal in British zoos might be? Anyone care to hazard a guess?
Corgis.
I see where you're going with that, yeah. Excellent. Well, no, but it's meerkats, right? They're 2 a penny in every zoo. Every zoo has to have meerkats. I don't know if that's the same in zoos around the world, but certainly in the UK they're extremely popular. But of course, you can see already that they're not directly related to. They're not a felid. They're not a canid. They're one of their own. They're part of their own separate evolutionary lineage. Second most popular is redneck wallabies, all the way over here with the marsupials. We don't have domesticated marsupials anywhere in the world. We have not co-evolved with marsupials. So our understanding of the basic biology and the needs of animals like marsupials is inevitably not going to be as good as some of these other groups of animals. I'm hearing a hum. Is it me moving around, or is it? Or is it just in my head? Don't worry, I'll crack on. So, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that, yeah, we've got significant gaps in our knowledge. But even within these families of mammals, that there may be considerable variation. I thought I'd look at some other species just to show the range of species we keep in zoos. So I started at the beginning of the alphabet. A for aardvark, which are kept in zoos. You may question this, but there are several zoos in the UK that keep aardvark and around the world. Looking at Web of Science for something as generic as aardvark and behaviour gives you 9 publications that have ever touched on the issue of what aardvark may eat, where they may forage, all these other aspects of their basic biology. It's not a great deal of literature to base your knowledge of an animal on. So from A, we went straight to Z for Zorilla, which is, again, I know we keep these in UK zoos, not many, striped skunks. And there's one paper that touches on Zorilla behaviour. Compare that with, and it's an unfair example, but compare that with pigs. And you get I'm just using this, it's a slightly facetious example, but just to give you an idea that our basic knowledge of wild animal needs, wild animal biology, is so poor compared to some of the farmed and laboratory species that we know and work with. So, in the UK, British zoos, 500 species of mammals. That's just mammals. So then take into account all the bird species, all the reptiles and all the amphibians. And I'm excluding domesticated species in this number. I'm excluding fish, no disrespect to fish. And I'm excluding invertebrates because I think there are arguments about welfare in invertebrates that we don't need to get into now. But I hope you're getting the sense that this is a huge topic and we know so little. So, is it safe to say that we can read across from similar species? Just picking an example here, dogs descend from wolves. That's one of 34 species within that family. Sheep, cattle, and goats, 3 species of 140 bovids. Rats and mice, domesticated rats and mice, more than 700 species. Can we make the link that if we know enough about mice and rats, we can apply that to all rodents? Obviously, I think you know where I'm going with this. I don't believe we can. Each of these species has their own evolutionary history, their own ecological niche, and that will affect their behaviour, that will affect their physiology, their morphology, and make them so specialised that it is not as simple as reading across from one to the other. Yeah, so Georgia Mason, who may be familiar to some of you because she's based in Canada now, formerly at Oxford, she's made the point that, can you see, closely related species with unexplained variation in captive welfare. So within the primates, within the lemurs, black lemurs and members, similar related species appear on the basis of evidence to do particularly poorly in captivity when compared to the more commonly kept ring-tailed lemurs. And I'm not for a minute saying that ring-tailed lemur welfare is absolutely great in captivity, but general trends show that there is a difference. Similarly, macaws seem to do it considerably more poorly than lorises, lorikeets, and the like. Again, looking at that enclosure, I'd argue with that, but you see the principle. These are closely related species. You can't make the automatic assumption that if you know about keeping these guys, it will deliver good welfare for these guys. So Georgia just had some more other examples. She chose, in my view, a fairly controversial example here, where she rightly, and I'm not sure how many of you have seen Blackfish, but I urge you to go and see it, points out that the welfare of orca in captivity can be particularly challenging. I disagree with her wholeheartedly on the welfare of bottlenose dolphins in captivity, but by the parameters she set out, they appeared, in her opinion, to do better than orca. Walruses appear to not do very well. I understand there's a huge problem in trying to get walruses to breed in captivity versus grey seals. And as we've seen, macaws and similar species do a lot worse than the smaller parrot family. And apparently, and I'm not sure of the evidence for this, sparrowhawks seem to do a lot worse than kestrels. But it doesn't stop there. I think even within the same species, you'll be able to see that it's not simple. I don't know if anyone's ever worked with junglefowl, but any of you researching poultry, you'll be well familiar with the fact that there are huge differences in behaviour between junglefowl, the ancestor of domestic chickens, and domestic chickens. My cat at the top there, Herbert, is his needs, and as you can see, he's probably needed a bit too much food there. His needs are considerably different to a Scottish wildcat at the bottom, despite these being so closely related that they actually interbreed, and that's a big conservation problem for Scottish wildcats. And my friend's dog, who lives in an apartment in Manhattan, his needs and his biology are going to be very different from his genetically almost indistinguishable cousin in the wolf. And this is a point that John Bradshaw has picked up on in his recent book, In Defense of Dogs, making the point that we shouldn't treat dogs as little wolves. So what do these differences in performance in captivity look like? These are, again, from Georgia Mason. She's identified issues such as breeding success, infant mortality, which I think is, frankly linked into the same thing, just overall mortality, the presence of stereotypic behaviour, the lifespan, behavioural traits such as aggression or playfulness being prevalent, and the ability to feed in captivity being different between these closely related species. An example of the last one, until recently it was next to impossible, if not impossible, to keep certain species of shark in captivity because they simply wouldn't eat. You could keep them for a while as they gradually lost weight, and then you'd have to chuck them out to sea again. So I just want to pick up on two of those just by way of example, breeding success and stereotypic behaviour. For those of you that haven't seen, he says optimistically, haven't seen stereotypic behaviour recently in a zoo animal, this is just something I saw in a European zoo the other day, not that long ago at all. I'm not sure if this is going to work. Let's see, fingers crossed. Okay, it's showing on my screen but not yours. Okay, so what happens in this video? It's just stereotypic behaviour. There's a honey badger there, and he's just route tracing endlessly. And I spent an entire day at this zoo, and that's all he did. Stereotypic behaviour, it's abnormal, it's repetitive, it's functionless behaviour, for those of you that are not familiar with it. And it's very difficult to identify the exact cause. but I think there's a strong point is that the natural biology of the species predetermines certain species to develop it more commonly in captivity. Just something I should mention in relation to stereotypic behaviour, particularly in carnivores, I often hear the excuse that it is anticipatory behaviour, so that the lion is pacing back and forth because it's going to get fed at some point. But I honestly think they're stretching the truth. When the lion paces for 7 hours, that's a lot of anticipation prior to its dinner in the evening. I'm not sure, what is an acceptable level of anticipatory behaviour? Where do we cut off anticipation versus proper stereotypic abnormal behaviour? So again, there's another paper from Georgia Mason and Ros Clubb, who's now at the RSPCA in the UK. They did some very interesting stuff looking at the prevalence of stereotypic behaviour in species, comparing that with the minimum natural home range size in the wild. And again, you can see that there's an association that means the larger the natural home range size is of the, and these are all carnivores they looked at, in the wild, the more likely the animal is to stereotype. So PB there is polar bears, which are notorious for stereotyping in captivity. I understand that the Dutch word for pacing repeatedly is a translation of to polar bear. That's how common it is. That's lions, actually, interestingly. So they seem to deviate away from the lion and be more likely to stereotype even than you'd expect. That's Arctic foxes, which appear to do the opposite. They seem to stereotype less than you might expect. And that's American mink, where I know Georgia is a world expert on the behaviour of mink in fur farms. So we've done stereotypic behaviour. What about breeding success as a welfare indicator? Those of you that work on production animal welfare, you'll know that production doesn't mean good welfare. But I thought, we're talking about wild animals. This is a tiger farm in China. And I think this is probably one of the better tiger farms in China, actually. It's all about breeding. There is no problem in getting these tigers to breed. That's what they're there for. And they're producing cubs like that. And of course, we know what happens to them. And if you don't, they're in pieces in jars, unfortunately. So the ability to breed in captivity, which is often touted as a sign of, the animal's doing fine. Look, we've just had babies. No, that's not how it works. And infant mortality, again, from the same paper by Ros Clubb and Georgia Mason, they looked at home range size and infant mortality, and again you see the same association, and again you see polar bears up at the top, not doing very well. The reason polar bears are such an extreme example is, as Ros and Georgia pointed out, the typical average captive enclosure is 1/1,000,000th the size of a polar bear's natural range. So I think you can see that even with the best will in the world, it's kind of difficult to replicate something that offers a polar bear enough space, enough complexity, that in a way that will mimic its natural environment. So the situation I believe that we currently face is that we know very little, or in some cases nothing, about a great many of the species that we keep. And as a result, I'm very concerned that it's possible that their welfare is compromised. And this sort of is hinted at by the fact that even the zoo community acknowledge that most of their best practice standards or current standards that are prevalent in the zoo community are based on just what we've always done, or on maybe trial and error, without an underpinning of science. And this is an area where I think a desperate amount of work needs to be done. Oh, we've lost a picture. Ah, no, it's come back. Many of you will be familiar with this. This is, it's been reproduced several times, and this is, I just stole from David's book. The three intersecting concepts of an animal's health and functioning: its affective state, its feelings, its mood, and its natural living. And my real fear with zoo animals, unlike so many other species, is our lack of basic knowledge means that we don't even know where we are on this diagram. We don't know where. I don't even think we're in any of these intersections, and we're certainly not in the centre. We don't know the basic functioning of so many of the animals that we keep. And we certainly don't even know the natural living of many of these animals. And we sure as hell are having a hard time working out what their feelings are. I mean, we have these species already in hand. We now have to play catch up to know more about how to keep them. So that's the end of the first part. I want to talk about a specific case study, which is obviously very dear to my heart, which is zoos in the UK. We have a long, long history of zoos or menageries in the UK, dating back to the 12th century, if not before. Many of you have been to the Tower of London. They don't still have wild animals. There may be a few corgis running around, I'm not sure. The animals eventually left the Tower of London to Regent's Park, and in 1847, Regent's Park Zoo opened up, as we now know it, London Zoo, open to the public. And roughly, at the moment in the UK, we've got about 300 to 350 licensed zoos in the country. So we've got quite a density of zoos in the country. And in terms of the welfare of animals in zoos, questions were asked as early as the mid-60s about what zoos are doing. A question was raised saying that legislation to compel zoos to observe proper standards by being licensed and inspected should be brought in. In answer to that, or partial answer to that, the Federation of Zoological Gardens of Great Britain and Ireland was established, and that's turned into BIAZA, which is the equivalent of AZA or CAZA or all these other zoo accreditation bodies that you might be familiar with. And there was even an attempt in 1972 to introduce a Control of Zoological Gardens bill, which would have required licensing of zoos. That didn't pan out, but in 1981, we did get some legislation requiring licensing and inspection of zoos in the country. It came into force in 1984, and I'm not sure how clear that is. So we've got the Zoo Licensing Act, but a few years later, there was the Convention on Biological Diversity, which many countries signed up to. And Article 9 of that requires member countries to commit to ex situ conservation. And that was interpreted by the European Union as, well, one of the ways they could deliver on that requirement was to ensure that all the zoos in the EU were licensed, inspected, and carried out conservation work. So a directive was issued in 1999 that it went across Europe. All European member states are required to license and inspect their zoos, and the zoos are supposed to carry out conservation actions. And so that fed back into the UK, that the Zoo Licensing Act was amended, meaning that zoos have to carry out conservation work. So these are the things that zoos must do. Zoos must promote education in relation to conservation and biodiversity. They must keep their animals under conditions which aim to satisfy the biological and conservation requirements of the species to which they belong. I would like to think that that's actually welfare. That's not just conservation. They have to stop their animals getting out. There have been cases of invasive populations of animals coming specifically from zoo escapes to stop animals getting in, and they've got to keep up-to-date records. So in the UK, in addition to those mandatory activities, zoos have to do at least one of the following. They have to do research relating to conservation, they have to do training, they have to exchange information relating to conservation. And I'm going to quote you now what that means, because I haven't got a clue. It says in the legislation that it's essential for zoos, they've got to exchange information, it's essential for zoos to carry out their conservation role effectively, and it's important that collections publish the results of their work. This can range from writing up husbandry and hand-rearing protocols to preparing community education materials for field projects. So that's cleared that up then. Breeding wild animals in captivity is a conservation measure that zoos can undertake. They have to do one of these, remember. And repopulation or reintroduction. And zoos in the UK are inspected by a government-appointed inspector every roughly 4 years. And the government inspectors report their findings on a standardised form, which uses a yes or no plus comments system. And that form recommends to the licensing authority whether the zoo should be licensed. And the inspector has to look at everything, not just animal welfare, but also whether the zoo is doing conservation, what conservation it's doing, whether their record keeping's up to scratch, and even things like public safety, or whether there's sufficient access to the public lavatories. So this is a lot for an inspector to do in what is generally a one-day visit. Amongst the animal welfare things that they look at, there are about 47, 48 criteria that the inspectors look at, and going back to what I said at the beginning, 47 of those 48 criteria are looking at inputs, and only one looks at how the animals are actually affected by the captive situation. Again, that's something I'd like to see change. So I did a little bit of a study looking at about 192 zoos in the UK, looking at the results of these zoo inspection forms. And firstly, let's look at the participation in the optional conservation measures. And you can see that, funnily enough, majority participate in exchange of information. It's great. A small minority doing reintroduction, repopulation. Quite a few doing captive breeding. I should point out that that doesn't mean participating in cooperative managed captive breeding programs. That is just, are you breeding your animals? And a couple of other things. So a reasonable amount of research and training. And reassuringly, 24%, nearly a quarter of the zoos are doing all 5. And so that's not, I was surprised when I found that. I think that's quite encouraging. Less encouraging is the fact that 11% aren't doing any, even though they have to do at least one. And actually that's backed up by an earlier study which asked the zoos themselves, what are you doing? And 9% of zoos said we're not doing anything in relation to conservation. So, yeah. Okay, so this is the results from the government-appointed zoo inspectors. There's no interpretation by me going on here. I've literally just tallied up the results. So up this axis, this is the number of problems found by inspectors, and these are the number of optional conservation activities that the zoos participate in. And I think you can see that there's an association, and it's statistically significant. The more zoos participate in conservation, the less their other conservation work has problems. That stands to reason, really. What's perhaps a little bit more interesting is that there's the similar association between animal welfare problems and participation in conservation. So, again, I say issues, it's basically number of, it's not quite correct, but imagine the number of citations that the zoos receive from the inspector for animal welfare problems, plotted against the number of optional conservation activities that the zoo participates in. So I think this, to me, is getting me back to where animal welfare and conservation interface. And just to show that was a single time slice, I've looked at it now for 2 successive inspections, so 3 or 4 years apart, and only 26% of zoos met all the standards required in relation to animal welfare at the first inspection, and 16% of those continued to meet the standards at the second inspection. Another 16% started to meet the standards, but we're still only up at 32% of the zoos meeting all the required animal welfare standards under the legislation. So I think hope you can agree there's a bit of room for improvement there. So that was the case study. Now I'm going to change tack completely. We're going to go outside captivity. We're going to go out into the wild. And we're going to start talking about conservation and animal welfare in a bit more detail. Historically, conservation has focused on the things in red here. This is very simplistic, and I apologise if it's glossing over a lot of detail, but there's a great interest in conserving genes. There's a great interest in conserving these aspects of things. And historically, the individuals haven't really got a look in. More than that, in a landmark paper by Michael Soule, a landmark essay in 1986, he set out what he viewed as the study of conservation biology. What is conservation biology? And you can see that in his mind it incorporates everything, including genetics, as we've mentioned, social science, philosophy, history, island biogeography, physiology. And I think that's an accurate enough thing. And interestingly, it includes a nod to veterinary medicine. So at least animal health gets a look in there. But he specifically states that conservation and animal welfare are conceptually distinct and they should remain politically separate. So, obviously that's going back a few years now, but that has been, in my opinion, the prevailing sensation that conservation and animal welfare exist in separate universes. And this, to me, is just something that it just doesn't ring true. A simple example, destruction of rainforests for palm oil production. You can look at that just in terms of, oh, isn't it terrible, we're losing rainforest. And that's entirely valid and that's entirely right. But in doing so, you're also overlooking some horrendous animal welfare problems and some horrendous individual animal suffering that is occurring at the same time. And to view the two as somehow separate it's a fallacy, in my opinion. More than that, activities that we undertake with the best of intentions in the name of conservation. We want to conserve resources, we want to undertake conservation. But some of these very same things are having a negative impact on animal welfare from tagging and trapping. So this guy has got a radio collar on an ear tag, to this cetacean where a tracking device that was previously affixed has fallen off, and I understand that this photo was taken several weeks after the device fell off. Again, you can see that there's a possibility for infection and possibly welfare problems there. We do a lot of killing in the name of conservation. We are, in so many ways, the first option in the name of conservation is to kill. So, for example, the use of rodenticides on islands to control rodent populations to preserve seabirds. We may also undertake things where the idea is not to kill stuff. It's very much to try and keep them alive. And so let's say we want to move this giraffe. It starts off with a really minor inconvenience, not really a welfare problem at all, a little dart on the butt. But it can end up in something as stressful as this, with an animal being manhandled into a lorry and that lorry transiting for hundreds of miles. And, I think we know enough from livestock studies to show that transport can have longer term effects on the welfare of an animal than you might anticipate. And of course, captivity. I've spoken at length about that already, so I won't revisit that. But if captivity, zoos are claiming a stake in conservation, we need to offset that against their potential and, in my view, definite impact on animal welfare. At the same time, we're still facing people who want to construct animal welfare and conservation as two separate, not even separate, but opposing directions. This statement here by, it was made in relation to the use of hot iron brands on sea lions in the southern hemisphere, in Australasia and the southern islands. And thanks to Kristin for this picture, by the way, which is unrelated to that, but it shows hot iron branding in marine mammals. And this sort of quote really just puts animal welfare at odds with conservation, and that's something that I firmly believe is just not correct. Again, another example, just on the reporting of conservation in journals. So conservation, I think this was reintroduction projects involving mammals. And the Lauren Harrington and colleagues at the University of Oxford looked at mentions of things like success and financial cost. And of course, they get a good look in there in the keywords, but animal welfare barely get a mention, and the ethics hardly at all. I think it's interesting to see that stress does get in there, so that the researchers are cognizant of stress, but it's not seeing it in the same parameter as broader animal welfare considerations. But of course, the two things can work hand in hand. This is a zebra that had been caught in a snare. This is the sort of project that Born Free funds, desnaring, where people go out and just collect up these awful things. Snares are indiscriminate. They kill a lot of animals, and they kill a lot of animals in a nasty way. Here you can see that one of the veterinary team is administering first aid to that animal. Snares kill threatened and non-threatened species indiscriminately, and the suffering is immense. It's obviously a meeting of minds to say that snares are bad for conservation and snares are bad for animal welfare. On the right, we've got Ethiopian wolves. There's about 500 or 550 or so in the wild, and they are critically endangered, and they are at threat from rabies from surrounding villages in their habitat in the Ethiopian highlands. They, I think you can see when you're down to numbers of individuals that are that low, the well-being of each individual is critical to the survival of the species. So again, you've got that confluence of welfare and conservation objectives. And in this case, the threat of rabies was so great that each and every individual wolf was caught and vaccinated against rabies. So again, you're actually getting a welfare benefit if you're an Ethiopian wolf, although you may not appreciate being caught and vaccinated. So at Born Free, we're trying to promote the idea of compassionate conservation, which is animal welfare in conservation practice, in a very simple sense. We like to think that the individuals matter, and that the well-being of individual animals needs to be factored in when we're making decisions in relation to conservation. In another way, compassionate conservation is a framework that considers individual animals within conservation research and practice, in which the focus historically has been on species, populations and ecosystems. And I think there's increasing evidence that better animal welfare is better conservation. Better animal welfare can lead to better science, which can lead to better conservation research. I like to think that compassionate conservation is actually greater than the sum of its parts. I think if you combine these two, you end up with something even better than just humane conservation practice. There are, of course, obstacles. As we've already seen, and I may be sounding like a scratched record, but there's a lack of basic biological understanding about the sort of animals that we're dealing with in the wild. There is an ongoing and extremely frustrating confusion everywhere I turn between animal welfare and animal rights. It's gradually changing, but it's taking a very, very long time. There's what I call knee-jerk conservation, which is there's an invasive species, let's kill it. There's something that's causing a threat to a threatened population, let's get the gun. It's very focused on lethal control. And I am definitely not advocating that we rule out lethal control. I am advocating that we need to go through all the other available humane options first before lethal control is considered. There's also this life is tough in the wild mentality that, we hot iron branded a few sea lions, or we've stuck a radio collar on a vervet monkey or whatever. He was probably going to get eaten by a predator next week anyway. What do the welfare of a couple of animals matter to the broader population? And I firmly don't believe that that is a valid argument. I think everybody can agree, from whatever side of the debate you come at, that harms to wild animals should be minimised wherever and to the extent possible. So where are we at with compassionate conservation? David and colleagues I know organised a workshop, I believe it was here, a few years back, and although David wasn't aware of our work at the time, we were so grateful to see that this workshop was taking place, and it was published, the proceedings of it were published in 2010. And we see that as absolutely coming together with where we were thinking at the same time. So we actually held a symposium, and I know David was there and several other people were there, in 2010 at Oxford, bringing together a whole host of animal welfare scientists, conservation biologists, conservation practitioners, ethicists, philosophers, you name it, everybody was there. And it was absolutely really heartening to see the amount of crossover that existed between these participants, and how empowering it was to see that conservationists felt able to talk about welfare in a safe environment. It was almost like that. It was quite incredible. Mark Beckhoff's recently published a book, which I urge you to seek out if you haven't read it already. Ignoring Nature, No More, The Case for Compassionate Conservation. It's an edited volume of different chapters by different authors. The Born Free Foundation has established the Virginia McKenna Reward for Compassionate Conservation, which is just a small token to recognise researchers and projects that are melding together welfare and conservation. And the recent recipient was Anna Nikaris from Oxford Brookes University, who has done some great work on slow loris conservation in Southeast Asia. Those of you that don't know, slow lorises, they're small nocturnal primates, unfortunately have become beloved of the pet trade, and they're being harvested in great numbers for export to other countries as pets. They're having their teeth filed down and their nails removed quite often in the process. And in addition to that, YouTube videos are playing, well, Anna's work has shown that YouTube videos are really undermining efforts to promote a positive conservation message about these animals. They are undeniably cute, but if you type into Google tickling loris, you're going to find a really cute thing cowering and being tickled. And this isn't doing nothing but feeding a demand for these animals as pets. So Anna's done some great work to show that these sort of videos are having a negative effect on people's attitudes to the conservation of this species. There's about to be, or it's kind of on the cusp of being set up, on the cusp of being announced, a Centre for Compassionate Conservation at the University of Technology in Sydney. Dan Ramp is spearheading that. And we've managed to set up a website which will be bringing together a lot of these various strands, because it's an emerging idea that people are really getting on board with. So, what are the benefits of a compassionate conservation approach? Definitely a reduction in suffering, definitely more humane conservation. But I really would like to think of compassionate conservation as a new type of conservation, a sort of conservation 2.0, if you will, and a whole new paradigm that fully integrates the welfare of individual animals into, into practices that are absolutely vital in the name of conservation. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed I'd like to thank my supervisors for my PhD in Bristol, Steve and Bill. I'd like to thank Detroit Zoological Society, who kindly funded me to come to this continent. I just happen to be here anyway. I'd like to thank Liv for very kindly organising this event and working with everyone to organise this event. I'd like to thank everybody on the Animal Welfare Programme, and I'd like to thank the Animal Welfare Foundation of Canada for funding this event too. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for a wonderful overview of the field and for telling us so much about the ways in which conservation and animal welfare can come together. I'd like to open the floor to questions.
I've clearly not answered everything. This is awesome.
Yes.
What's your take on animals being brought into zoos who have been injured or, who need attention and help?
No, I think that's a very good question. I think there is a totally justifiable reason to do that, as long as the long-term welfare considerations are taken into account. I mean, it's naive to assume that just because an animal's injured, it's somehow going to be happy in captivity. If it's missing a wing, it's still going to want to fly and forage and hunt and all the other things. So it's a question of being very aware of the animal's needs. And this is why a lot of rehab facilities euthanize, because they don't think that you can meet the needs of a formerly wild animal by taking it into captivity. The jury's out on that, and some facilities will euthanize and some won't. I think it's got to be judged on a case-by-case basis, species by species. It's not a very definitive answer right now, I'm sorry.
Chris, thanks for the great lecture. I just wanted to get your thoughts on, and I guess in part follow up with what we talked about yesterday, this idea of zoos and the place in terms of trying to help these zoos versus sort of the long-term goal of whether or not, the question of whether or not animals should actually ever be in zoos. And given your, I guess maybe this is something what you're trying to do with your PhD work, is over the last few years of doing your PhD, are you feeling that zoos, I mean, obviously they're in a conflict of interest because they're making money on this, but how do you feel is the uptake by them with some of these things that you're trying to push?
Right. I think there is certainly uptake, and there is certainly individuals within the zoo community who are becoming increasingly well versed in animal welfare and this sort of thing, and I think that is nothing but a good thing. Whether it extends industry-wide yet, I don't really feel it does. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And on the flip side of that, I think there's a massive capacity amongst people within zoos for consideration of animal welfare. The minute you get talking to them about, about the care of their animals, I realise, they realise that there is a massive amount of crossover between NGOs like Born Free that cast a critical eye on zoos and the zoos themselves. Most people involved on both sides of the fence agree on almost everything. What Born Free would like to see is that, particularly in terms of conservation, captivity may not provide the solution, and that we should perhaps move away from that. It does come at a welfare cost. Denying that it comes at a welfare cost is not helping anybody. I would urge zoos to be more open honest with themselves and more transparent, and then I think we would have so much more in common and so much more to talk about. And it should not be an adversarial meeting the whole time.
Yes, right in front.
With the increase of the human population being now over 7 billion and continuing to increase in the next 10 to 20 years just in the most horrendous way, the idea of repatriating animals to the wild, of course, becomes problematic because the wild is disappearing faster than one can hope to ever maintain it. What is the philosophy behind trying to take animals out of zoos in order to repatriate them into a place which is going to become non-existent?
Well,
extremely pressurized by the existing populations there.
You've described the situation absolutely accurately. I'm not advocating taking animals out of zoos and putting them in the wild, because frankly most of them would die if you did that. Most animals in zoos these days are captive bred, and they're not equipped with the behavioural and ecological responses necessary. What we're trying to do is to focus on the welfare of animals currently in zoos and not add to the problem. And what we should be doing, and you're right to acknowledge that things are on a really bad downwards trajectory, our efforts have to be on slowing or stopping that downward trajectory, not on multi-million-dollar exhibits in zoos, where the majority of the money is being spent on the visitor experience, not on the care of the animal. This is where and I personally have quite a big problem with what some activities of what zoos are doing.
In the back, yeah.
Chris, you pointed out some flaws with the British or the European regulatory system, and in terms of their ability to gain compliance or assure compliance. There's very little regulation in Canada for zoos, and if we were to be pushing for more in Canada, would you recommend advocating for a similar approach, but conducted more effectively, or would you argue for a completely different model?
No, I wouldn't want to reinvent the wheel. I think similar but better is probably the answer on that one. I think inspections are vital, but I think unlike the British model, inspections should be unannounced. They should be more frequent, and they should be genuinely independent. I think one of the features we have, and without defaming individuals here, one of the problems with the system we have in the UK is government-appointed zoo inspectors who do quite infrequent inspections, frankly. Half of the list are vets who are competent in zoo animal welfare. They're only competent in zoo animal welfare because they work in zoos. So there's a little bit of a conflict of interest going on here. The other half of the list are zoo directors, zoo curators, that type of people. So you're dealing with people who are part of the industry. I'm not sure who else you could bring in. I can't offer up all the solutions, but that's one aspect to it. The frequency of inspections needs to be absolutely increased, and the sanctions, more importantly, the sanctions for non-compliance need to be, well, they need to be there. There really aren't in the UK system. If you don't meet the standards, you're obviously given time to comply, but then quite often there isn't a check to ensure that the compliance has actually taken place, and it only comes around at the next time. I did another part of the study, I didn't show there. In 25% of cases where a condition was applied to the zoo's license, which is the version of a sanction, you're given a condition, you've got to do this within this time period. In 25% of cases, those things hadn't been complied with at the time of the next formal inspection 3 years later. So, someone tells you, gives you a slap on the wrist, and you just go back to business as usual. So that would be an aspect that I think in Canada, if it was to be considered, would need to be really carefully watched. I could talk about that all day, though.
Thank you. Yeah.
Does your work also address the businesses that have swimming with dolphin encounters?
It's not something I've worked on myself, but, well, because fortunately we basically, although not on the statute, but we have the equivalent of a ban on dolphinaria and captive dolphins in the UK. I'm aware of it as a tourist activity. It's of considerable concern. I mean, captive cetaceans, you are facing a hell of a challenge if you want to meet their welfare. And if you're throwing into the mix interactions with people, you know, I don't have the facts, but it straight out of the box, it gets me concerned.
I just want to know, like in your evaluation criteria for the animal welfare and zoo, you said that there was only one criteria out of 48. I think that we're evaluating output.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know why. Like, why is it so hard to have more?
That's a great question. The system is predicated on a one-day visit. And that one day they're going to have to look at the books, the enclosures, everything. To do any sort of meaningful outcomes-based assessment would take more time. I think that's the primary thing. The other thing is, you know, it's been in place for quite a few years now, and the thinking about inputs and outcomes has only really started to be refined and sophisticated with respect to zoo animals in very recent times. It's just, you know, regarded as an easier shorthand. Let's look at what we're giving the animals rather than how the animals are coping. Again, I think a lot of time and effort could be devoted to developing reasonably quick outcome-based measures. But at the moment, that rests entirely at the individual institution level. That it's up to the zoo to monitor the welfare of their own animals and at that level. And again, you know, if we can't do it under a sort of regulatory system, there should at least be a regulatory requirement that zoos must do it. And again, there isn't that at the moment, unfortunately. That's what we want to do, but to see it happening, great, yeah, absolutely. If you guys are wanting to set up a centre for compassionate conservation here, then no, I think it can only be a good thing. I think, you know, my own experience at university, my experience of talking at various universities, particularly within the UK, even at the level of teaching students, it's still two separate disciplines. And I mean, I'm doing my degree in biological sciences, even though we have a very strong animal welfare department in the vet school. So one of my supervisors is based there. There's so little crossover. No disrespect to my university, but it's the nature of the beast. The more we can integrate these things, the better. Yeah. Wow. There has to be, there's actually just the other day, there was a very high profile thing in the UK where there was a sort of travelling show that was set up by a shopping centre, and a load of animal welfare groups have suddenly realised, you know what, we should be speaking out against this. It had like a raccoon riding a scooter and stuff, but the reason for it being there, the reason they had sold themselves to the shopping centre was as an educational and conservation exhibit. And I'm sure for the kids that were in the audience, it would have been mildly captivating. So I think there's an element that we need to start asking genuine questions about the value of these things and just get outfits such as that to be honest. Are you doing conservation? Really? How? You're actually just an exhibit. And then secondly, you know, perhaps more importantly, there's got to be an element of public education. How you do that is a very big question. It's beyond my expertise. But people are trying, and I do see some really good advances being made. But just when you think you've turned a corner on one thing, something you'd never anticipated crops up, like tickling slow lorises. So yeah, the more awareness we can raise, the more exposure we can give to these things in a critical sense. I really think that's the only answer.
I have one last question for you, Chris.
Sure.
And that is, you brought up the issue of how sometimes well-intended researchers working on
Yes.
the ecology and conservation of animals might actually also be causing animal welfare harm.
Yep.
And you talked about, for example, painful marketing
Yes.
procedures. Do you have any other, so as a big research university, where we've got lots of colleagues working on wildlife type studies, what would you say would be sort of key areas that we should be providing them help with in terms of avoiding and overcoming some of these welfare?
Well, I would assume that you would have an institutional policy on research, and I think that is the best starting point. And the ones that I've seen, and I can't speak to UBCs obviously, but the ones that I've seen are a great first step, but they tend to not go into enough detail, and they tend not to focus on the need to absolutely rule out more refined or humane approaches first. I mean, it's a 3 R's type situation, that there's a lot of consideration of ethics in these institutional policies, but the ones I've seen have not spelled out the process that the researcher should go through in order to make that decision before you even use something like tagging. You know, radio collaring is perceived as entirely benign, but you do a search of the literature, you turn up all these horrible cases of things, you know, dying or of suffering, you know, reduced welfare as a result of something, you know, almost as comical as a radio collar. So there's got to be some fundamental questions asked at every stage. And there has to be this other 4th R, which has been proposed, that of refusal. If you don't think it's going to meet the criteria, you've always got that option to say no. And that is something that I feel facilities, universities, researchers themselves, they're not taking advantage of that 4th R enough.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, Dan.
I'd just like to by way of closing, to say that it's really wonderful to have you bringing together the welfare and conservation issues. Living in British Columbia, where in Vancouver, where we have a strong sort of animal welfare sensibility, but also in a province that prides itself in its outlook towards living a special place for putting these issues together. And I'd encourage people that are interested in this issue to come and talk to some of our own students in the program, especially Liv Baker. Liv, just wave. And Sarah Dubois, who's in the front. Wave higher, Sarah, so I can see you, who are working on these issues around the interface of wildlife and conservation. And I'd ask the audience to join me in thanking Chris for a brilliant lecture.
Thanks very much.